Everyone believed she was dying. A sick girl trapped in a wheelchair, dependent on her mother for everything. But behind closed doors, nothing was what it seemed. Because the girl everyone felt sorry for was hiding a secret, and the mother everyone trusted was hiding something even darker. Her name was Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and this is the story of a lie so twisted. It ended in murder. To the outside world, Gypsy Rose was a fragile, sick child. She used a wheelchair. She spoke with a soft, childlike voice, and her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard, was seen as a loving and devoted caregiver. People admired her. They praised her strength. They donated money, gifts, and even helped them get a home. It looked like a story of love and sacrifice. But there was one problem. Much of it wasn't true. Before we get into this case, we want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to True Crime Journal for more chilling stories like this. Everyone who met her believed the same thing. She was sick, a fragile young girl trapped in a wheelchair, battling illness after illness, completely dependent on her mother for survival. Her name was Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and to the outside world, her life looked like a tragedy. But what if everything people believed about her was a lie? Because behind the sympathy, the donations, and the emotional stories, there was a secret no one saw coming, and it would eventually end in murder. To understand what really happened, you have to go back to the beginning. Gypsy Rose was born into what seemed like a normal situation. Her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard, had once been in a relationship with Gypsy's father, but that relationship didn't last. Her father was not a major part of her life growing up. He lived separately and had limited involvement in raising her. That meant one thing. From a very young age, Gypsy's entire world revolved around one person, her mother, and that level of control would shape everything that followed. As Gypsy grew up, something unusual began to define her life. Illness. According to her mother, Gypsy suffered from multiple serious medical conditions. She was said to have leukemia, muscular dystrophy, seizures, and several other chronic health issues. Because of this, Gypsy was placed in a wheelchair. Her head was often shaved, supposedly because of cancer treatments. She spoke in a soft, childlike voice, and to anyone who met her, she looked exactly like what her mother described. A very sick girl. But here's where things start to feel off. Despite all these serious conditions, there were inconsistencies. Doctors occasionally questioned details. Some things didn't fully add up, but every time concerns were raised, Dee Dee had an answer. She controlled medical records. She moved locations frequently, and she made sure she was always the one speaking on Gypsy's behalf. Over time, questioning stopped, and belief took over. To the outside world, Dee Dee Blanchard became something else entirely. A devoted mother, a caregiver who had sacrificed everything for her child. People admired her strength. Neighbors respected her. Strangers sympathized with her. Communities came together to support them. They received donations, gifts, and even a home built through charity. It looked like a story of kindness and compassion, a struggling mother being supported by people who cared. But inside that home, things were very different. Gypsy had almost no independence. She wasn't allowed to speak freely. She couldn't make decisions for herself, and she had little to no contact with the outside world without her mother present. Even simple things most teenagers take for granted were completely controlled. Her life wasn't just restricted, it was monitored, carefully. However, began to notice small things. Nothing obvious, nothing they could prove, just subtle details that didn't quite match the story. Sometimes Gypsy seemed more aware than expected. At times, she didn't appear as physically limited as her condition suggested. But every time curiosity grew, it was quickly shut down. Dee Dee always had an explanation, and people didn't want to question a mother caring for a sick child. So doubt stayed quiet, and the image remained intact. But behind that image, a different reality was forming, one built on control, deception, and something far more disturbing, because what no one fully understood at the time was that many of Gypsy's illnesses were not real. They had been exaggerated, or in some cases, completely fabricated. There is a condition known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. It's when a caregiver creates or exaggerates illness in someone else to gain attention, sympathy, or control. And many believe that this is exactly what was happening inside that home. For years, Gypsy had been living inside a reality that wasn't entirely true. A life shaped not by illness, but by manipulation. And as she got older, something began to change, because no matter how controlled her world was, Gypsy was starting to see beyond it, starting to question things, starting to want more, freedom, independence, a life outside of the one she had always known. But wanting freedom, and getting it, are two very different things, and the path she would eventually take to escape would shock everyone. For most of her life, Gypsy Rose had lived under constant control. Every movement was monitored, every conversation was filtered, every decision was made for her. But control like that doesn't last forever, especially not when curiosity begins to grow. As Gypsy got older, she started to notice things. Small things at first, moments where reality didn't quite match what she had been told. She began to question her own condition, her own limitations, and slowly, a new thought started forming in her mind. What if she wasn't as sick as she had always believed? But questioning something like that wasn't easy, because every time doubt appeared, her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard, was there to shut it down. She controlled the narrative completely. Doctors trusted her, neighbors believed her, and Gypsy had spent her entire life hearing the same story over and over again. So even when doubt appeared, it was buried just as quickly. But then something happened that changed everything. Gypsy discovered the internet. At first it was small, moments alone, quick access when her mother wasn't watching. But that small window into the outside world quickly became something much bigger. Because for the first time in her life, Gypsy could see how other people lived. People her age, people with freedom, people making their own choices. And the more she saw, the more she realized what she didn't have. A normal life, independence, control over her own body. That's when she started reaching out, talking to people online, creating connections her mother knew nothing about. And eventually, she met someone. His name was Nicholas Godejohn. At first, their conversations seemed harmless. Two people getting to know each other, sharing thoughts, talking about life. But over time, things began to change. Their conversations became deeper, more personal, more intense. Gypsy started opening up about her life, about the control, about the restrictions, about how trapped she felt. And Nicholas listened, for someone who had never truly been heard before. That meant everything, because for the first time, someone was on her side. But that connection didn't just stay emotional. It became something more, a relationship, one that existed entirely in secret. And like many secret relationships, it began to grow stronger the more it was hidden. They talked often, they shared ideas, they built a bond that felt real, even if it existed behind screens. But there was one problem. Gypsy wasn't free, no matter how strong their connection became. She was still living under her mother's control, still being watched, still being restricted. And that's when the conversations started to shift. From connection to escape. At first it was just talk. What life could be like if she were free. Where they could go. How things could be different. But over time, those ideas became more serious. More detailed. More dangerous. Because leaving wasn't simple. Gypsy didn't have access to money. She didn't have freedom of movement. And most importantly, she didn't have the ability to just walk away without consequences. Her mother had built a system that kept her dependent, controlled, and isolated. So the question became, how do you escape a life like that? And the answer they began to consider was one that would change everything. Because instead of finding a way out, they started thinking about removing the person who was keeping her trapped. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a single decision. It was something that developed slowly, through conversations, through frustration, through a growing sense that there was no other option. And once that idea took hold, it didn't go away. The plans started to form, details began to take shape, and what once seemed unthinkable started to feel possible. But there was still one question. Would they actually go through with it? Because thinking about something and doing it are two very different things. By this point, what started as a secret connection had become something much more serious. The conversations between Gypsy Rose Blanchard and Nicholas Godejohn were no longer just about feelings. They were about action. For Gypsy, the situation felt impossible. She had spent her entire life under control. Every attempt at independence had been blocked. Every question she asked had been shut down. And over time, that frustration turned into something stronger. Desperation, because in her mind there were only two options. Stay trapped forever, or find a way out. But leaving wasn't simple. Her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard, had built a life where Gypsy depended on her for everything. Money, movement, access to the outside world, even basic decisions. So the idea of escape began to shift. It wasn't just about leaving anymore. It was about removing the obstacle. And that's when the conversations took a darker turn. Gypsy and Nicholas began discussing a plan, not just to run away, but to make sure Dee Dee could no longer stop them. At first, it may have felt distant, unreal, like something that would never actually happen. But the more they talked about it, the more real it became. They discussed details, timing, how it would happen, what each of them would do. And slowly, a plan was formed. Nicholas would travel to meet Gypsy. He would come to the house, and together, they would carry out something that couldn't be undone. When the day finally came, everything changed. In June 2015, Nicholas Godejohn traveled to Gypsy's home. This was no longer just an online connection. This was real. Inside the house, the tension must have been overwhelming. Gypsy knew what was about to happen. Nicholas knew what he had agreed to do. And in the next few hours, their lives would change forever. That night, Gypsy waited in another room, while Nicholas went into the bedroom of Dee Dee Blanchard. What happened next is one of the most disturbing parts of this case. Dee Dee Blanchard was attacked in her bed. She didn't survive. And just like that, the woman who had controlled Gypsy's entire life was gone. For a moment, it may have felt like freedom, but reality doesn't work that way, because once something like that happens, there's no going back. After the crime, Gypsy and Nicholas didn't stay. They left, trying to move forward, trying to start a new life, but their actions didn't go unnoticed for long. Days later, something appeared online. A post, disturbing, out of place. It caught attention quickly. Concerns started to grow. People who knew Dee Dee began to worry. And when authorities were alerted, they moved fast. What they found inside the house confirmed the worst. But what they discovered next was even more shocking, because as the investigation continued, police tracked down Gypsy and Nicholas, and when they finally located them, the truth began to unravel. The girl everyone believed was sick was standing, walking, talking normally. The image that had been built for years collapsed instantly, and suddenly, this wasn't just a murder case anymore. It was something far more complicated, because now the question wasn't just what happened. It was why. Why would a daughter be involved in something like this? Was this a calculated crime, or was it the result of years of control, manipulation, and abuse? As the truth about Gypsy Rose Blanchard began to spread, the public reaction was immediate and divided. At first, many people saw only one thing: a daughter involved in the death of her own mother. And for some, that alone was enough to form an opinion. But then the details started to come out. The years of control, the fabricated illnesses, the isolation, the manipulation. And suddenly, the story didn't feel so simple anymore. Because the more people learned about what Gypsy had been through, the more the narrative began to shift. Instead of asking, how could she do this? People started asking something else. What would you do if you were in her position? And that question changed everything. Experts began to speak out. They pointed to the possibility that her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard, had been suffering from a condition known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a disorder where a caregiver creates or exaggerates illness in someone else, often for attention, control, or sympathy. If that was true, then Gypsy hadn't just been raised in a strict environment. She had been living inside a carefully constructed lie, a life where her identity was controlled, her reality was manipulated, and her freedom was taken away. For years, that perspective changed how many people saw her. Some began to view her not as a criminal, but as a victim who had been pushed to an extreme point. But not everyone agreed. Others argued that no matter the circumstances, taking a life could not be justified, that there were other options, other ways to escape. And this is where the case becomes truly complicated, because both sides raise valid points. Yes, Gypsy had been controlled and manipulated for most of her life, but she also made a decision that led to a violent outcome. And that's what makes this case so difficult to define. It sits somewhere between two realities, victim and participant. As the legal process moved forward, the courts had to decide how to interpret that reality. In the end, Gypsy Rose Blanchard accepted a plea deal. She was sentenced to prison, while Nicholas Godejohn received a much harsher sentence. And even in that outcome, the complexity of the case remained, because to this day, people still debate what justice really looked like here. Was it fair? Was it balanced? Or was it simply the closest answer to a situation with no perfect solution? Years later, this case continues to spark discussion, but because of what it represents: control, manipulation, and the consequences of living in a reality that isn't your own. And maybe that's why it stays with people, because it forces you to think, not just about what happened, but about how easily perception can be shaped, how easily a story can be believed, and how dangerous it can be when the truth is hidden for too long. So now, after hearing the full story, we want to hear from you. Do you believe Gypsy Rose Blanchard was a victim of years of abuse? Or do you think she crossed a line that can't be justified? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this case as disturbing and thought-provoking as it seems, make sure to watch the next video on your screen now. Because some stories don't just end. They stay with you. Subscribe to True Crime Journal for more chilling and complex true crime cases every week. Because sometimes, the truth isn't just shocking, it's complicated.